Welcome everyone to our Gender Identity in the Church Night. Thank you all so much for coming to learn about gender and sexuality. Our guest speaker this evening is Dr. Deanne Stewart. She earned her BA and MHum from the University of Dallas and her PhD from Baylor University. Over the years, she has received various teaching awards at the middle school, high school, and college levels, including Campus Teacher of the Year on 2 campuses, District Teacher of the Year, and Outstanding Graduate Student Instructor. Currently, she works as Associate Director of Curriculum and Outreach at the Austin Institute for the Study of Family Life and Culture, where she spends her hours finding and translating good social science research primarily on marriage, family, and sexuality into a format friendly to non-specialists. Her most recent project was to translate research on sexuality and gender issues for church and civic leaders. Please join me in welcoming Deanne Stewart.
I can take my mask off, so I will. This is what my face looks like. I hope to see yours someday. That'd be great. So I want to thank Father Greg and David for inviting me to speak tonight, and thanks to you all for showing up to discuss one of the most fraught issues of our day, gender identity. When it comes to this issue, there are 1,000 ways to misstep. I'll do my best to avoid as many of them as I can, and one of the ways that I do that is to type up my remarks so that I don't accidentally misstep in any way. I pray that I would not fail to testify to the truth, but that I would do so with loving kindness, so that even if there are people in this room who identify as transgender or who are struggling with gender dysphoria, you would not for a minute think that I bear anything but goodwill toward you. So the contents of this presentation are the work of about 4 years of reading and reflecting as a Catholic woman and as an academic. Here's a quick outline of what I'm going to cover within the next 30 minutes because I want to leave plenty of time for Q&A because people have questions, and this is your chance. We get to talk about it tonight. After that, I'll open the floor to questions from you. So I'll begin first with a brief explanation of the Catholic Church's consistent position on sex differences. Next, I'm going to address some of the objections to church teaching that I have heard most frequently, answering those objections with both Catholic texts and scientific studies, but mostly with scientific studies. Finally, I'm going to address a question that I'm often asked. How should I respond if someone comes out as trans and says that they want to transition? So I'll spend just a few minutes talking through that. So let's start with what I understand the Catholic Church's position on gender identity to be. And Father Craig, you can correct me at any time if I'm wrong or if I say something that needs to be clarified. I'll start with a conversation I had with a principal at a Catholic school recently. She said, I keep watching all the documents on gender identity that come out from the Vatican and through other Catholic sources, wondering if they're ever going to change their position on it. But they don't. They keep coming out and saying the same thing. So what is the same thing that the Catholic Church keeps saying again and again? In a nutshell, the position is this. God created human beings, male and female. Scripture tells us this, and our senses confirm it. 2, men and women are complementary, meaning they're different, but in ways that mutually build each other up. And 3, the human body is good and should be respected and received as a gift, not as something that we try to dominate or manipulate. So, those are the major points in this document right here. It was published recently, 2019, by the Congregation for Catholic Education, called Male and Female, He Created Them, Toward a Path of Dialogue on the Question of Gender Theory and Education. It's not a long read. It takes maybe an hour to read through it, and it's a well-constructed document. It's not too hard, so if you ever have a free hour, I would really strongly encourage you to pick this up because it so clearly lays out the Church's position on gender theory. So this document is a good place to start. But if you really want to dig more deeply into what it means to be sexually differentiated, I would actually pick the works of this woman, St. Edith Stein, a brilliant 20th century academic, feminist, and Carmelite nun who was killed at Auschwitz. Edith Stein was a female academic at a time when women were not academics. Some of the most influential philosophers of her day recognized what a strong mind she had, and they praised her for it. But because of the time, she couldn't secure a position as a professor. Instead, she worked as a secretary and later as a high school teacher at an all-girls school. Some call her a feminist, others call her a suffragette. She advocated for women's entrance into the professions, into law, medicine, higher education, and so on. In her memoirs, she confesses that she often felt that she had more in common with men than with other women. Yet she still celebrated her womanhood. She wasn't bitter about it. She considered it to be a gift, one she had to learn to use well and rightly. If you want to read what she says about identity, I would read in this book right here, Essays on Woman, pages 183 through 202, because she does a good job of summarizing what I'm about to present in diagram form. This is the diagram that I put together. Basically, St. Edith Stein says that human beings can be described on 3 different planes. First, there's the level of their humanity. This is the most general level. Next, there's the level of their sexual differentiation. Are they male or female? And finally, there's the level of their individuality, which is incredibly varied. In other words, if you were to ask me to break down my identity right here and now, I would start by saying, well, first and foremost, like all of you, I'm a human being. As a human being, I'm different from the other animals. I can reason. I have an immortal soul. I'm made in the image and likeness of God, and I have tremendous dignity, as do you all, because of that. Next, I am a female, and I share that with about 50% of you. So my body is different than a man's. My shoulders are probably narrower than a man's. My hips are undoubtedly wider. I'm not as physically strong as most men are. I have the reproductive organs of a woman. And because my body and soul are connected to each other, I also share some psychological traits with other women. So psychologists and other scientists say that females on the whole are more verbal than males. Although my 3-year-old son would probably talk me into a corner any day, on the whole, females tend to be, and I'm talking in terms of large tendencies, tend to be more verbal than males. They begin speaking more quickly than boys do. Even as newborns, they're attracted to human faces, while boys tend to prefer abstract shapes and pictures of mechanical things. They've actually conducted studies on newborns who are a week or less old, so they haven't had the chance to have their gender constructed for them. They're only a week old, and the girls, on the whole, not all of them, but a majority of them prefer the pictures of human faces, will respond to those, whereas the majority of the boys will respond to more abstract shapes. So even as young as that, you start to see some differences emerging. Now, not all newborn girls are attracted to human faces, but the majority of them are. Men tend to be greater risk takers than women, and learning how to describe their feelings does not come as naturally to them. Now, please remember, these are descriptive differences, not prescriptive ones. So I'm not telling you that you're not a woman or not a man if you don't demonstrate these traits. I'm just saying that science says that females tend to display certain traits more often than men, and vice versa. Now, these differences are complementary. Biologically, our physical differences result in the generation of new life. Psychologically, we learn from each other and grow toward each other so that we can achieve greater balance. For example, a best-selling therapist and researcher, his name is John Gottman, he says that when he asks women to list all the feelings they experience over the course of a week, they can rattle off a long list. I felt scared, I felt sad, I felt frustrated, I felt overwhelmed, I felt connected, I felt satisfied. When he asks men the same question, their lists are predictably shorter. Most often he hears, I felt angry. The point here is that one thing women can teach men is a more comprehensive language for their emotions. One thing men can teach women is how to take calculated risks, because women are often more averse to risks. On the whole, they value security more highly. The lessons go both ways, and we are all better off for this complementary exchange. Again, I'm not saying that all women are this way or that all men are another way. I'm just saying that biologically differences exist, and they are life-generating. Psychologically, some general differences also seem to exist, although these traits won't be equally present in all men and all women, and they are also life-giving. Finally, if I were to examine my identity, I would say that I'm a person who identifies herself according to her relationships with other people. I am a mother, I am a wife, I am an aunt, I am a daughter, I am a sister, I am a friend, I am a coworker, I am a boss. My relationships with all these people define who I am. They give me an identity. Then there are certain traits that make me unique as a person. I like whiskey. I'm good at fixing things around the house. I'm a good teacher and an attentive listener. There are a million other things that identify me as a unique person at the level of my individuality. As I said before, I get these three fundamental levels from St. Edith Stein in her essays on woman. First, we're humans, and as such, there are certain traits that we all share with each other. Secondly, we belong to our sexed communities, and there are certain patterns and traits we often observe within those communities. Finally, we are persons with so much variety between us that it would be a futile exercise to categorize us at all. Now, I know there are people who will say that this system for identifying myself is repressive, even though Edith Stein was and is considered to be a feminist for her time. People might say that it fails to take into account the sheer variety that exists in the world. Let's take those objections seriously. Is it repressive? I don't think so. It's not repressing what I can do as a woman. I can do anything I have the talent and motivation to do, whatever I'm called by God to do. But whatever I do, I still do as a woman in my own unique way. If I want to campaign for political office, I do it as a woman because that's who I am. If I prepare a lunch for my son to take to school, and most often it's my husband who's doing that, I don't think I ever prepare his lunch, but I would do that as a woman because that's who I am. So this model doesn't prescribe certain things I can do and can't do. It just says that my being a woman comes to bear on whatever I do. Next, does this model fail to account for the variety of people we see out in the world? It seems to me that there's so much variety in this model. 3 different levels, lots of relationships, many different ways to express my femaleness, so many differences at the level of my personhood. Within the Catholic Church, we see this variety on full display in our communion of saints. There we will find the intellectual, Edith Stein. We will find the soldier, St. Joan of Arc. We will find the physician and mother, St. Gianna Molla, who sacrificed her life for her unborn child. Among our male saints and other blesseds, we'll find that same kind of variety. The intellectual, St. Thomas Aquinas. The mountain climber, Pier Giorgio. And the newly identified servant of God, Carlo Acutis, who spread devotion to the Blessed Sacrament online. So we find this great variety, all these different ways to be male, all these different ways to be female. Yes, someone might say. But there's not enough variety at this level, at the level of the sexes. There aren't just 2 sexes. That's a binary, heteronormative, cisnormative power structure established by white men to oppress people who do not belong to their class. We've got to break the binary. Okay, again, let's take this objection seriously. Let's look at the evidence that there are more than 2 sexes. Let's see. And this is where I get into some of the science. We'll look first at the biological evidence that there are more than 2 sexes. Scientists typically look at in two areas. They look first at genes, and then they'll look at brains, at brain structure. These are the two places they've looked at most when they've done any research on transgender individuals. And what have they found? They haven't been able to find a specific trans gene. They haven't been able to locate one specific gene. Some scientists say that there might be a cluster of genes that affect someone's identity, but they don't know exactly what's in that cluster, although they have lots of suggestions. And even if they could identify a cluster, genes would not likely be the deciding factor. In some of the best research we have, the genetic contribution is usually about a third or less, and the rest is an environmental contribution. So genes can predispose us towards certain behaviors. They can predispose us, and perhaps even towards certain identities. But the best studies seem to indicate that a person's environment actually plays a more significant role. Next, let's look at brains. There's also no conclusive evidence that someone who identifies as trans has a girl brain and a boy's body, and again, or vice versa. They've tried to find this evidence. I have here a summary of, they call it a meta-analysis, a review of the literature, a summary of some of the research on brains, on brain science. And what these studies show on the whole is that a biological male's brain never functions exactly like a biological female's brain. Even if that male begins taking cross-sex hormones, in some ways his brain might begin to resemble a female's, but mostly it operates like a male's, or it operates in what they call a demasculinized way. If you were to do a Google search right now, you would likely find studies that say trans people do have the brains of the sex that they identify with, but those are often the outliers. In science, we look for where the majority of the studies cluster. That's where we find scientific consensus. Right now, we have nowhere near the number of good studies we need to have on trans-identified people to even start talking about a consensus. The research is too new. That's not what the media tells you, and that's not what some of your professors tell you. But ask any honest scientist without an ideological axe to grind, and he'll state that we just don't know enough to draw any hard and fast conclusions. And he'll tell you that the quality of the research we have right now is not all that great. I'm going to return now to the imaginary person I'm in conversation with. Let's assume that this person is willing to say, all right, so there might not be any conclusive biological evidence that would prove that there are more than two sexes, but there's still a person's subjective experience. Some people have a strong sense that they are not in the right bodies. Their bodies feel alien to them. They experience a sharp division between what their minds tell them that they are and what their bodies say. And this internal division can cause them a great deal of pain. Like most people, I too, on occasion, have felt alienated from my body at times. I've hated it, I felt imprisoned by it, but I know that my experience can't be anywhere near the pain felt by those with gender dysphoria. The church is not indifferent to the pain of people with gender dysphoria, which is why they're always saying, charity, charity. We always speak with charity and kind and open-heartedness. The church also wants healing for people gripped by gender dysphoria. She wants trans-identified people to experience that body-soul unity that they long for when they start talking about wanting to transition. It's a longing for a body-soul unity. But, the church says, the way toward unity is not through manipulating the body with hormones and surgery so that it conforms to the mind. That method will always be incomplete. Let's say you're a biological female. No matter how many hormones you take, with all their terrible side effects, and no matter how many surgeries you undergo, you can't change yourself at every level because you can't go down and change the genes. You can't alter all the biological markers that distinguish you from males. Instead of pursuing that path, the church exhorts trans-identified people to attempt, as far as they are able, to change their minds so that they conform with the reality of their bodies. And you can't accomplish this just by willing it. I don't want to sort of belittle that, the gargantuan effort that is. You'll probably need a lot of help, and even then, you may not be successful. But down this path lies the greatest potential for life and healing. We want you to be whole, the church says, but not by surgically altering your bodies. There's another way. This stance seems highly insensitive to some people. They cite the high instance of suicides among those who identify as trans or experience some type of gender dysphoria. When people are dying, they say, you do whatever you can to save their lives, even if it means destroying healthy organs or injecting people with artificial hormones. How do we respond to that? They're right about some things. Trans-identified people do show more suicidality than the population as a whole. They experience more anxiety, more severe depression, more substance abuse. Some studies show that transitioning might relieve some of these mental health problems, at least in the short term. But there are problems with some of those studies that are coming out. For example, this was a recent study by a couple of researchers. It came out in 2019. One of the researchers was a Yale professor. And you can see the headline, Mental Health Outcomes Improve for Transgender Individuals After Surgery, Study Finds. One of the researchers, John Pachenkas, said, no longer can we say that we lack high-quality evidence of the benefits of providing gender-affirming surgeries to transgender individuals who seek them. The problem is that they discovered there were all sorts of problems with his methodology, with his calculations. He actually had to go back. This was one of the most comprehensive studies so far because they looked at a whole population to see what patterns that they saw. He had to go back and issue a correction because he found when he corrected his calculations that surgery actually had no positive effect on the mental health of transgender individuals. Of course, this study spread like wildfire all over the media, and not many people have heard about the correction, which is, I think in August, the correction was issued. As it turns out, you find that their study there was no improvement on mental health. Not all studies show positive effects. You just don't hear about the ones that don't. Some of the data coming out of the UK and the United States shows that teenagers who go on puberty-suppressing drugs and receive cross-sex hormones show higher instances of anxiety, depression, and suicidality. But even if there is what some scientists call a honeymoon effect, an initial high after transition and surgery, researchers have serious concerns about the long-term effects of transitioning. A study, this was a recent study, showed that people who had gender reassignment surgery still sought mental health care at a similar rate after surgery as they did before. So what does this study show? It shows that perhaps the study says it doesn't have the positive effect on mental health that people are looking for. Another study, and here's one, a huge one, showed that people who received gender reassignment surgery were still 19.1 times more likely to die by suicide than the population as a whole. So suicide rates were still shockingly high after they transitioned. Why are the numbers still high even after transition? Some therapists and medical professionals speculate that some people may transition out of the belief that the reason why they're experiencing so much anxiety and depression is because they are trapped in the wrong bodies. If they change their bodies, then all the other mental health problems will go away. Years after surgery, when the honeymoon period is over and the mental health problems they were experiencing have not gone away, people despair. They did everything, even had surgery, and here they are dealing with all the same crap all over again. For these reasons and more, the church urges people with gender dysphoria to get to the root of what they're experiencing and to seek healing there. Take a clear and honest look, they tell people, at any past trauma. Squarely address any problems with mental health. Wrestle with social anxiety and the feeling that you just don't seem to fit in with the members of your sex. Have hormone levels tested. Seek wholeness, mentally and physically. Take a moment to pause before resorting to more radical medical and surgical interventions. The hands of the king bring healing, Tolkien writes in The Lord of the Rings. How much more true is that of our king? The hands of the king bring healing. We have the great healer, Jesus Christ. And I have to pause here to answer two possible objections to what I have just said. Am I saying that being trans is all in the mind? Listen, We don't fully understand what causes someone to identify as transgender. There may be a genetic, physiological component to it, like a cluster of genes. But even if there is, that genetic component alone does not determine a person's life and all the choices he or she could make. At the same time, it's very true, and studies back this up, that we do see a very strong correlation with other mental health problems among people who identify as transgender than we do among the general population. I've listed here some of the studies. I'm not saying that mental health problems cause gender dysphoria. That link hasn't been proven scientifically. What I am saying is there's a tight correlation and that mental health problems shouldn't be ignored. Transitioning is not a silver bullet that will relieve all pain while instantaneously giving people the community and identity they long for. We can hold mental health problems underwater for a while, but not forever. They just keep bobbing back up to the surface, and it takes a lot of effort to keep pushing them back down. I'm also not saying that you can pray the trans away, like some religious leaders have been caricatured as saying that same-sex attracted people can pray the gay away. Do the hands of our King bring healing? Yes, they do. Will they bring complete healing to every person? Maybe not. For some, healing might mean a less severe form of gender dysphoria. Some people may continue to experience gender dysphoria for the rest of their lives, and it may bring them great pain. I don't wish that pain on anyone. But I also know, and this has proven true in my own life time and time again, that the area of our greatest pain is often where God meets us most intimately. It's there, in the intimacy of our deepest pain, that we realize how broken we are. It's where we learn how to completely rely on Jesus. And it's very often one of the primary vehicles God uses to sanctify us. Where we are most broken, our loving Savior rushes in and turns the curse into a blessing. You don't just have to take my word for it. This is what my same-sex attracted friends who are leading celibate lives have said. This is what my friends who have wrestled and are wrestling with gender dysphoria have said. Have hope. He works all things for our good, even when, and maybe most especially when, it seems that nothing good could come out of it. Before I wrap up, I want to address one final practical question that people often ask me. How do I respond if someone tells me that he or she is trans and is thinking about transitioning? I'm not a counselor, so I don't have any particular expertise in this area, but I have talked to several therapists and other adults who do. And I'm going to share some of the things that they have told me. This is what they say. First, oh dear. I don't have my list right now. First, respond gently. That's the first thing. Respond gently. Thank the person for trusting you enough to share this information with you. Assure him or her that you care and you're not going anywhere. They haven't shocked you or scared you away with their news. Next, if you feel the person has left the door open for you, ask questions that will help you to better understand where the person is coming from. How long have you felt this way? What makes you think you're not a man or a woman? What is that like for you? Don't lecture. Let the other person talk. People often make the mistake of responding to people right away with things like, well, you know that the church teaches ... or let me give you all the reasons why you're wrong. That's not effective. Listen first, then speak. Third, I would suggest that you urge the person to press the pause button for a while so that she can talk things out. I use the pronoun she here because right now that's where we're seeing the largest uptick in trans-identifying people among teen and young adults, is among the female population. So I have here, this is data just so you can sort of see what's going on. This is data from the Tavistock Clinic. It's a clinic out of the UK. There's only one pediatric gender identity clinic in the whole country of England, which is why we have this data, because we have data for a whole country when you look at the Tavistock data. And here in the United States, we have 50 plus, and it's really hard to get data from all those sources. So we get a snapshot here, and we're seeing the same phenomenon over and over in all these other countries around the world. Is this right here. Age when referred. So these are referrals to the Tavistock Clinic, years 2018 to 2019. You can see that right down here, the majority of the people who are referred are males. You can see these numbers going through here. And then you start to see this big uptick right around the age of 12. 12 climbs at 13, 14, 15, 16, and then starts going down at 17 and 18. And they're just not referred to this clinic anymore after 18 because they're now adults, so they go to the adult clinic. But you'll notice right here, this is where the surge is occurring right now. We're seeing a big surge since about, really since 2014 is where they're starting to see an increase right there. And about 80% of those referrals are females. So you can see what's happening overall with the population, that this is where we're seeing the most movement right here, most change is in females, teenagers, and then also in young adults. And you can see it happens right around the age of 12, which is close to the onset of puberty. So there's something that's going on here. They don't know what. The researchers are saying, please, can we research this a little bit more? But it's not getting the kind of traction that they're hoping. They want there to be more research. So according to a researcher at Brown University here in the United States, many of the American young women who are currently coming out had recently experienced trauma, either sexual trauma, the trauma of their parents divorcing, or of a death in the family, the trauma of moving schools or losing friend groups. 48.4% had experienced recent trauma. A majority of them also suffered from severe social anxiety. You can see 69.4% suffered from severe social anxiety. Most strikingly, 86.7% had a friend who'd recently come out, had recently started spending more time on social media and YouTube right before coming out, or had some combination of these two factors. So a very large number of young women, this is true for them. I bring this data up because maybe after listening for a while, you suspect there could be some underlying issue that your friend is experiencing that a therapist might be able to help with. So you recommend that she talk to a counselor. Only after listening should you voice your concerns. But don't be preachy. Let this person know that you trust the church on this one, that you don't want her to pursue drastic measures where there could be another way, that medical and surgical interventions are irrevocable and risky, that there are many negative side effects. I can give you just a few. A few of them that they found, this is with puberty-suppressing drugs. Some of the effects of puberty-suppressing drugs they found, decreased height, so decreased stature, people who didn't achieve their full height. Decreased bone mineral density, so that's what the little bone icon is for. Infertility, and then also this one got me, impaired spatial memory, that's the question mark right in the head. They conducted a study on sheep, not on humans because that's unethical, and so they conducted a study on adolescent sheep, and they trained them to go through this maze again and again and again until they got it down. And then they gave half of the sheep, the adolescent sheep, the puberty-suppressing drugs, and then the other half were drug-free. So those that were drug-free went through the maze just fine, but those who were given the hormone-suppressing drugs, they couldn't make it through the maze. They weren't able to make it through, and most of the time they got confused in the middle of the maze, and most of the time a sheep will bleat whenever they're in trouble, but they didn't even bleat. They just stood there quietly inside the maze. So this is one study that's been performed that has led some scientists to say, whoa, let's just slow down here because we don't have a lot of good research yet, and there could be extremely harmful effects to some of these drugs. For people who go on cross-sex hormones, there are additional effects, increased aggression in some people, heart attack, higher chance of heart attack, many other problems there too. But whatever you say, we're going back to talking to your friend, whatever you say, the important thing is that that person knows you care about her and that conversational lines with you are open. Please be aware that convincing someone to press pause may be exceedingly difficult. The internal division that someone with gender dysphoria feels can be severely painful. That friend or family member of yours is going to feel desperate to do whatever is necessary to make the pain go away. You may also find that your friend has become hyper-focused on gender to the exclusion of everything else. And this is backed up by some studies. Even those hobbies and relationships that she used to greatly treasure, she doesn't treasure so much anymore. It's hard to get through sometimes to somebody who has become so hyper-focused because it's so real and pressing for that person. Your friend is also probably going to be told on social media sites perhaps, and I'm quoting from an actual Reddit post, if you don't transition now when you're young, you'll be miserable and unhappy with your body for the rest of your life. So there's this sense of urgency that you have to act now. Or they're being told that the longer they delay, the harder it will be for cosmetic surgeons to convincingly make them look like the opposite sex. Maybe your friend has already gone to a gender identity clinic and the doctor who saw her once has already prescribed medication of some sort. This happens more frequently than we may think. There will be a lot of social momentum propelling your friend toward transitioning right away. So even doing something mild, like trying to persuade her to press pause, might be seen as an act of aggression or as an impossible request. Try anyway, and be loving no matter what. I want to just wrap up these points. Respond gently, ask questions, press the pause button, share your convictions. Do share your convictions with your friend, especially if you have a good relationship with your friend. Seek help. If you think that there's some area, listen, I think that this is really bothering you, maybe you should just go talk to somebody about it. Encourage that person to seek help. So with that, I want to wrap up these prepared remarks and open the floor to questions. Thank you all for your attention. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask them.
If you have questions, oh, there it is, wow. If you have questions, I am the guy that will bring you the thing that can ask the questions. So, any questions to start off? Well, I have one. So, whenever it comes to the whole issue of someone asks you to call them by their pronouns, right? Like, how do you go about that in a charitable way, but at the same time, like not backing down on like our rock solid convictions that we're made male and female?
Yes. So this is one thing that I do, is I, as far as possible, because the thing is that St. Thomas Aquinas talks about this. When we speak, there has to be a certain correlation between the words we say and the reality that we see. And if there is no correspondence between those two, then it's a lie. Then we're telling a lie. So one thing for me personally is I think, well, I can't lie with my language. But there are a lot of things that I can do because I don't walk around trying to cause offense to people. And especially if it's going to cause an unnecessary problem, if it's going to cause unnecessary hurt. So one thing that I try to do sometimes is I try to avoid he or she pronouns. And so I'll just say you. If I'm talking to a person, I can say you. Or I can refer to that person by name. And I did actually have an hour-long conversation with a former student of mine. She's wonderful, but there's another former student of mine who's come out as non-binary. And we had a whole wonderful conversation about DeAnn. And I never once had to put myself into that bind. So it's possible. It's possible. Did you want to add anything, Father Craig? Yeah.
One of the challenges you say in there is seek help. And obviously people come to me for help, which is great. I'm happy to do my best to help. There are those who are skilled in treating sort of the underlying sort of traumas or anxieties and these sorts of things. But as you noted before, there is a lot of pressure out there to transition. And sometimes in the helping profession, that is seen as the helping option, and they pressure as well. It's hard sometimes to determine who is a trustworthy help. Do you have sort of a way of doing that or evaluating that?
You mean for
counseling,
like
for, we want to give the best information, but there's a lot of misinformation out there. And unfortunately, some of the professionals in various fields have fallen into the misinformation that's there. It's not research reliant, for example. It's not I mean, and of course, not all counselors are acting according to the principles of our faith, these sorts of things. How do you help someone navigate the things that are out there if you're recommending them to find help that's more than what you can give?
Great. I'm going to unplug this because I actually do have a resource right on here, but I don't want to have to scroll through all of mine so I can get to it. There is a website that gives some questions. This is what I'm looking for. It gives some questions that you should ask any mental health professional to help you see where does this mental health professional stand. And so I think that it is called, hold on just one second. Here are my handouts. Okay. It's actually a website for parents, but I think the questions would work. It's parents of rogdkids.com. Parents of rogdkids.com. And there they give you a list of some questions that you can ask mental health professionals. I would say also, I know that in the Austin area, the Intuitus group tends to be really solid. It's sometimes hard to get into them. Another one, I think that there is a Protestant counterpart too that I can't remember right now. There are some, if you look at ACPEDS, American College of Pediatricians, they have some Texas counselors who might be able to give, who even if they aren't in this area, might be able to give virtual counseling sessions. Or I would say contact us. We're the Austin Institute for the Study of Family and Culture, and we're actually working right now on building up a coalition of Catholic, specifically Catholic counselors who are well schooled in Christian anthropology. They know what it means to be human. Their foundation is strong in their Catholic faith, and they also have that element of counseling and psychology. So we're specifically asking therapists and others to come to receive this training so that we'll know where they are. Because right now, sometimes, I mean, the therapists are kind of keeping their heads down. Some of them are afraid that they're going to lose their licenses. So they're kind of keeping a low profile. But yes, definitely, those are some things that you could do, some places where you could look. Other questions, folks? I want to hear them. Yes, please.
I was just asking because does everything you talked about kind of apply to intersex people as well? Is that the same or would it be different?
Oh, thank you so much for bringing that up because I intentionally left that out of the presentation because I wanted to keep it at 30 minutes. And so I was hoping somebody would. Thank you for doing that. So intersex individuals, these would be people, and this is how they would describe themselves. There's either some kind of genetic mutation or there's a hormone problem. You end up with congenital adrenal hyperplasia or androgen insensitivity disorder. So what are these two things? So sometimes it happens in the womb that a biological male would not be able to process the testosterone or all of the androgens. His body would be insensitive to it, androgen insensitivity disorder. And so that's one thing, he wouldn't be able to process it, and sometimes his genitalia would then end up being more ambiguous. Same thing for females. Sometimes they start processing, biological females will actually process all of these androgens. And so it can affect their genitalia. The number of people, at least for whom this is, where it's indistinguishable, is very small percentage. And they're saying probably about 0.1% of the population. So it is a small percentage of people. But there's an excellent article written by Father Nicanor Austriaco. He's a biologist and he's a bioethicist who's teaching out at Providence College. And he addresses exactly this. What happens then for intersex individuals? What do we say? What do we say about them? If we're saying that they're just males and females, then what do we say? And he actually gives a beautiful medical, thought-provoking, sequential way of thinking through this. He said eventually, even with intersex individuals, you'll often find that the reproductive organs will develop either one way more or another way more. You won't often see the split half and half. You don't see that very often. And so he says that even then, if you look at the reproductive capacity, you'll often be able to say, male or female. So what you're saying about intersex individuals, at least from everything that I have seen, they don't feel the same rush to transition. They're actually saying, whoa, 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 halt. Because what was happening for intersex individuals is their parents were deciding at the moment of birth what surgical procedure they would have. But the intersex individuals are actually saying, no, halt the surgeries. So it's interesting because that's a difference that you see between intersex individuals and then what I was talking about with trans individuals. Does that answer your question, or did I go off on a bunny trail? Okay. Great. Yes.
This is very much talking about the Catholic Church. So, like, going out on campus, how do we have these conversations with those who aren't Catholic or aren't even Christian? Like, how can we still have these conversations, like, with charity, but obviously we can't use Scripture, or those who don't believe? Like, how do you actually have these conversations well?
Mm-hmm. Do you have anything to say, Father Craig, while I think through? You might be able to. I'll think.
So I guess, from the pastoral perspective, and Josh, you and I have talked about this many times, is you want to lead with love. We are very concerned with the truth, but love is how we begin the conversation. And I've shared with, I think, a number of you, just the model for that from a Christian perspective is John's Gospel, chapter 4. When Jesus meets the woman at the well, you don't begin the conversation with, you've had 5 husbands and the one you're with right now is not your husband. You don't begin with the moral questions typically. And so if you're setting out to go on campus to address the moral questions, you're probably doing it wrong. Because while the end goal is that people would live life in conformity to the truth of Jesus Christ, to love God with their whole heart and their neighbor as themselves, and to live in that communion with one another, we want to incarnate into the life of the person, to meet that person where they're at, and to listen, to understand, and to will their good and love them in the time and place that they are. Now, when you are forming that authentic relationship with the other, you say, give me a drink of water, right? Is how Jesus bridges the gap between the persons. He starts the conversation, and he elevates the conversation upward until it does meet the question of religion. I am the Messiah, right? Is the final sort of place before he addresses a moral question, and it leaves it to her to accept that or not. But in terms of how to have a conversation sort of as a faith individual with someone who does not share our convictions of faith, it begins with love, caring about them, listening to them, asking questions, which I'm not always the best at. I make the mistake often of trying to jump to the problem, solving the problem. And so I know that's a problem for many of us, where we want to speak that truth. We want to speak that truth. We actually have to learn a certain humility and patience to listen and to understand, and with humility there. But then we ask questions. I think with this particular issue, the thing that'd be most helpful is the research, because people are more willing to accept medical research, social research, than they are to sort of jump to the faith perspective. Now, I think the faith perspective is what I would like to offer people, but they're probably going to be more willing to listen on this particular medical issue to experts who are probably not religious. And so I think there's many people out there who do these studies, and people think, oh, it's a Catholic or a Christian who's doing this study in order to prove their faith already. But what's out there that is sort of from, I actually kind of love it when I find an atheist who is a research person who is speaking the truth with conviction, with good, solid reasoning, and that. And I think that probably appeals to people more than the faith perspective on this. So I'm not sure, Josh, when you say, okay, so I'm on campus, I'm talking to somebody, and it comes up and they say, well, I'm trans, right? And what does your church say about that? I think, the response that I think is, well, the Lord loves you. He desires the best for you. I care about you and I will your good. Help me understand what you experience. What are the things that you experience when you think of faith, and it's the questions, and I don't have like a 1, 2, 3, 4 answer to that. You kind of have to tune into the Holy Spirit, let him lead you, but remember the good of the person is the first thing, and the moral response of faith won't make sense until they've met the person of Jesus Christ, have fallen in love with him, and want to follow him, and then the moral questions make more sense. But in terms of what you might say to this from a research perspective, or offering them medical information so they could make good choices even if they're not a person of faith, that might be the thing that I would be interested in.
Yep, so I just want to back that up. I have a lot of friends who don't think the same way that I do. But we're still friends. So these conversations have to arise out of real friendship. And so that's the first thing, is that, and I like you, and I want to talk to you about this. And I love what Father Craig said about asking questions, listening to the person, but not being afraid to say, here are some things that you might be willing to hear. So what are some of them? I tried to structure this talk tonight in such a way that it takes the objections seriously. Like the objections that you've heard, it takes them seriously. And that's one thing I always try to do when I'm talking to people. Like, I might not agree with what you're saying, but you know what? I'm your friend, and what friends do is they go alongside friends. And so I'm going to go alongside you, and I'm going to try to understand where you're coming from on this. And so I think that was why, for me, this big revelation, just realizing that that the church wills the union of the body and the soul. And if I can be charitable and say that even somebody who is saying, I need to transition, that person is seeking the union of the body and soul. But so I can see that, but I'm just saying, I don't know if that path will bring you the greatest happiness because there are all these reasons, some of them that I spelled out. So might not bring you the greatest happiness because is there something else? People are sort of rushing to transition before they fully deal with past trauma. And a lot of times they're not even asked about it when they go in. They're not having to deal with other problems that are going on. Social anxiety is a really big one. Never feeling being very anxious, especially about interacting with the same-sex peer group. A lot of social anxiety there. And so I would say there are all these other things that could be going on that if they're not dealt with, that won't solve. So why don't we see, this is where I think that the church's response is so brilliant, and saying, whoa, I want the whole person. I want the person to be whole, and I want you to be whole. So these are some reasons why perhaps you should pause. That's why I said, just say pause. Let's press the pause button. Let's talk about some of these things, and maybe the open doors with some of these scientific studies where the science isn't great right now. So if you take a drastic measure and the science is not great, then that's a pretty extreme action. And so sometimes we can, even if the person you're talking to they're not considering transitioning, even if that's not the case, like you can point out several of these things where the science just says, number one, where is it located? Is it in genes? Is it in the brain? Well, maybe there is something to the psyche. There's something psychologically that's going on. That's one way you could address it. Or even just saying the outcomes of surgery aren't so great. So why don't I bring some of those up? Those are some good things to bring up, I would think, to maybe get some traction with your friends.
Just one little follow-up on that, but then one question for that too. So the follow-up is I don't want to say for this particular issue, but often what happens when I meet someone who has what I think an erroneous belief about our Catholic faith, and I think I know our Catholic faith pretty well, and so when someone says, "Well, you Catholics believe this," the question I would say, "Oh, where did you hear that from? Who told you that?" Well, and it kind of brings up sort of the question of why we believe certain things are true, right? Because a lot of times what happens is we hear something and we don't critically evaluate it, and we accept it as true before we really have a good evaluation of it. And I would ask that question, and I'd say, well, I think maybe you've been misinformed or been given some bad information. Can I offer you an alternative perspective, or what we actually believe as Catholics? And I want to offer you other information to consider, right? And that could be a helpful sort of thing here is like, okay, well, where have you heard that transitioning will actually solve the experience that you're having? Because I've heard some different information, and I'd be happy to present you with good information for your consideration.
That's great.
So that might be a great way to approach it. The question I wanted to follow up with is, so you're having this conversation and you want to give people good information, where do you go? What's a resource for us to go to find this good information instead of Googling it, and that's what we all do? Is there a place we can go to get good information?
Yes. There are 2 places where you can go. Number one, I can't believe I didn't bring a book, but the Austin Institute, we put together a book of graphics. So what we found was that there was all this research out there, but nobody has time to go through all the research and to read lots of numbers. Oh, come on. And so what we did was we just made these little graphics to quickly summarize what some of the research said. So that's actually available online. There are a lot of studies, and these are not cherry-picked studies. These are the leading studies. Like one of the leading researchers on, especially with children, is her last name is Cohen-Katenis, and we cite her studies in this book. So we're just going back to the original data that we found in the studies. So that's one place. I think it's called. It's an orange book. It's Sex and Gender. I'll find the exact title for you in just a second. But another place to go is Canavox, Canavox. Canavox is put together, it's a kind of a study group. It's put together by some very, very smart, mostly Catholic women. Although what they say, it's not denominational, it's not confessional. Like they're just saying they're using studies too. But there is this one video our book is called Sexuality and Gender, a Companion to the New Atlanta Special Report. The video is called Sex, Gender, and Identity by Anna Samuel. So what she does is about 38 minutes. She has her PhD in philosophy, and she goes through in about 38 minutes and kind of summarizes what some of the research says. So that's also a good place.
What's her name again?
Anna, A-N-A, Samuel, S-A-M-U-E-L. And her video is Sex, Gender, and Identity. So that's another great resource, I would say. One that I also found very enlightening, it's on YouTube. It doesn't have studies in it, but it's called Detransition Q&A. It's these 3 young women who, when they were in their teens, so you know that graphic that I showed you? This was true of them. Like when they were in their teens, right around puberty, they started to have these, they started to not feel comfortable in their own bodies. They started to think that perhaps they weren't female. And so 3 of them actually did take cross-sex hormones. They went down that path, 1 of them did not. But then they ended up detransitioning. And they're not religious. They're just very candidly talking about their experiences. It's about, I think it's about 30 minutes long. But what they're saying as they were talking through their experiences, I was able to say, oh my goodness, I read that in this study. I read that in this study. I read that, but they're talking about their personal experiences. So to sort of see that backing up what all of these studies were saying was also really formative for me.
I had a quick question.
Yes, sir.
So is there like any correlation between people who identify as transgender and same-sex attraction? Is there like a strong correlation there? Do they have like the same kind of root, or is there not really anything conclusive on that?
They have seen a strong correlation between those two. So they said that sometimes, they'll say that sometimes someone who is same-sex attracted will say, I think that I'm trans because there are these same-sex attractions that are stirring in them. So that actually happens fairly frequently, so much so that I had one day at the Austin Institute, this one woman called up and she said, listen, I am a lesbian and I just need to tell you I'm looking for allies because I'm tired of young women who are same-sex attracted being told that they're trans or are being influenced in that direction. And so it's really interesting. It is a common phenomenon. So I'll just leave it at that. Yes, right back here.
I feel that.
So, like, what would you say if someone, like, is it possible to be Catholic and be transgender? What would you say?
What do you mean by transgender?
So, like, say, like, they were raised Catholic and, like, they decided to transition and they still, like, want to be in their faith.
I'm going to let Father Craig take that one. Well, I'll start. If he wants to think about what he's saying, I will say this, that like, to live in the fullness of the Catholic faith, what does the Catholic faith want from us? It wants wholeness. It wants us to love our bodies. And so I think that there are some things that the church would want for us. Is it possible? Does the church welcome somebody through their doors? Everyone is welcome through the doors of the church. And the church is a field hospital. It's not where everybody is perfectly well formed. I mean, we're all welcome here, and we all grow together. We're all sisters and brothers. And so, as far as though, would the church say that if you're living out a trans identity, and I don't know what that would mean. Like, I don't know if it just means that I prefer more masculine-looking clothing. I don't know if that means that I want to change my name and my pronouns, or if it means that I want some type of medical or surgical interventions. Those, the church, medical and surgical interventions. So I don't know exactly what that would mean. It could mean a lot of things. But I would say that everybody is always welcome to come and walk together, but the church would want that person's wholeness and would want that person's healing.
Yeah, great answer. I think the challenge that I would be worried about is if you know what the church teaches and you knowingly reject that, there's a dissonance there, right? And there's a disconnect there that would be worrisome for me. Now, I mean, as Dr. Stuart said, like, the church's door is open to everybody. But when people walk through that doors, we're going to invite them to live according to truth, right? We're going to invite them to live according to the truth of the human person, the truth of God making us male and female. We're going to invite people. The whole point of truth is that we would be changed by it, because that's what's going to fulfill us. That's what's going to bring us to the deeper desire of wholeness that we all long for and desire. And so it would worry me that someone would know the truth and not be willing to conform to it, to be changed by it. That speaks to me of a level of the heart that is not open to God, and that would be a concern for me. Now, is the church always going to welcome you in? Yes, but the church is not going to deny their convictions or the truth, and they're going to speak it. So be ready for that, right? We're going to talk about the good of the human person. We're going to talk about being made male and female in the likeness of God and what that means, the complementarity between the sexes, what marriage is. We're going to talk about those things, and we're not going to water those things down, because, again, the truth will set you free, right? And the Lord tells us that I am the way, the truth, and the life, that's where our greatest fulfillment lies. So we're always going to talk about those things, and I want that for every person. But it would concern me if someone knowingly and willingly chose to live contrary to the faith. And this does happen in all sorts of walks of life. I know, not just in the issue of transgender, but people who will come to the Catholic Church and say, I accept these things, but I don't accept this on abortion, or I accept these things, or I don't accept the church's teaching on marriage, or I accept these things, but I think it's awful how the church doesn't allow women to become priests, right? These sorts of things, and I want the same fullness of truth for every one of them. And again, it's not out of hatred or anger or frustration, but it's because I love them, and I want the fullness of that truth for them. And one of the general dispositions, basic dispositions of faith is, I recognize that I am a person who, by sin, have separated myself from God. I surrender myself to God, that His will be done in me to change me, right? To bring me to wholeness and fullness, which I long for, that restoration, that redemption. And so that's what I desire for every single person who walks through the doors. And so it would concern me if any single person in the room isn't able to make the profession of faith that every person who becomes a Catholic says, which is, I believe everything that the Holy Catholic Church teaches, believes, proclaims to be revealed by God. I hope that addresses it a little bit.
And I would say several times throughout my life, it doesn't mean that when I come to church, sometimes about some things, I say, I accept, I believe everything that the Catholic Church teaches, but I'm really wrestling with it right now. And yes, wrestle away. I mean, the church welcomes that. That's what I found, because I've really had to really challenge hard several things, but I've never been disappointed. But in the meantime, while I'm struggling through it, I accept.
Well, great talk. So several of my students have now made the argument that we should get rid of gender completely, because their argument is, well, if men and women are different, to be different doesn't mean to be unequal. So how would you defend the equality of the sexes, even though men and women are equal?
How would I offend the...
How would you defend the equality of men and women, even though there are differences? Excuse me.
Okay, so how would I say, yes, you can be both different and equal? Yes. That kind of a thing. I think that this is definitely something that we need to sort of work on our language for. I know this is kind of what I was getting at when I was looking at all those female saints, the powerful female saints, the powerful male saints in their different ways, very powerful in their different ways. And I'm not trying to say that everything boils down to power, but I am saying that there is a certain sense in which I think that what has ended up happening is that women have thought, there's a friend of mine who says that, she said she's afraid that this whole erasure of the genders has resulted in this statement: congratulations, women, you are now free to be a man. Because it seems like that's where the whole, destroying the differences between the sexes is kind of where it's gone. Like if you want to get ahead in business, you have to be more masculine in business. If you want to have a great career, then you have to forego marriage and family. You can't do that. Like you can't take care of your kids. So what it's resulted in is women feeling like they have to become more like men. And it's deeply dissatisfying. Because it doesn't allow women to enter into roles of leadership. And this is one thing that Edith Stein talks about so beautifully. She said there are certain things that women typically bring to a conversation about whether or not a law should be passed. She said men tend to think in terms of the abstracts. Well, how would we structure the law so that it is equal for all? Men sort of think in these abstracts, whereas the women are able to say, if that law were in effect, this is how it would affect Bob. Like they think in a much more sort of personal, concrete way. And she says if you don't have that female perspective, then the law that's passed will be inadequate because it doesn't have that perspective coming in and saying, no, we must consider this in order for this law to be just. So she does a beautiful job of showing that you can have both people in these positions, but there has to be some appreciation for differences. And I'm afraid that this is often what's happened even with dating between males and females, is that we don't appreciate each other's differences. We don't celebrate each other's differences. We don't appreciate each other's differences. And as a result, one researcher that we work with at UT, he said that the sort of erotic, the eros that would spring up between men and women often would spring up because there's this tension between differences. And so without that, we're seeing like the death of eros because there's something here that's fruitful in these differences that doesn't have to mean that there's a power differential. So I think that's the mistake, is in saying that if we're not exactly alike, then there's going to be a power differential. I don't think that that's true. I think that women can transform engineering by doing it as women. There are a lot of things that we can do here in order to both celebrate who we are. And I think it starts there with women celebrating who they are, their fertility, celebrating who they are and everything that they have to bring to the world. And whether it's the world of their home or it's the broader world or both places. Yes.
Just to follow up to his question for you, I mean, I'm thinking of how I might respond to something like that, and I'm wondering, sometimes we're constantly trying to respond from reason. What are some appeals to things beyond reason is one of my questions, because I think sometimes our culture doesn't always respond to reason well, because there are so many differing opinions, differing authorities, differing research, differing doctors, all these sorts of things that are out there. Have you experienced maybe an appeal from beauty? Because I think to myself, like, there's something beautiful about men and women who are equal in dignity and worth from the faith perspective in the eyes of God, that God loves them equally, right? But the differences are beautiful. That complementarity that you're discussing, like that, the beauty of that is something so appealing. I mean, if I want to laugh, for a conversation, I can tell a story about a little boy who does something because he likes a little girl, right? And you're like, oh yeah, I'm thinking about my first grade experience of asking a girl out in the playground, and she goes, ooh, you have cooties, right? And she runs away. Like, it's fun. There's something beautiful about those differences at play. So I don't know if you've experienced any arguments or demonstrations from that might be helpful, or thoughts on that. I don't know.
Yeah, arguments from a life well lived. I don't know how else to say it. Because I think you can see when men are really secure in their masculinity and are living their lives that way, it's pretty apparent and attractive. It's pretty attractive, and you don't have to make any rational arguments for it. Same thing for women. I found when women confidently stepping into their femininity, like stepping into it, it's very attractive. So I would say lives well lived, that's often the most persuasive argument. A movie, John Krasinski's, what's the name of that? The Quiet Place, yes. Yes. I have wanted to get some college students together to watch that film, to look about, because what we see in that film is kind of like a masculine response to danger that's incredibly courageous, and a feminine response to danger that is incredibly courageous. And so I'm just being able to see those two. Films, stories, that's the argument from beauty. We see that in films and stories. And I know that I do try to whenever something comes up, instead of saying, like, we're a male, you're like, oh, that's so male. Like, instead of groaning, like to say, oh my gosh, that is just like a man would respond. or that is just like a woman would respond, or whatever it might be, but to kind of, to appreciate it. We have got to appreciate these differences, because this is where our personhood is rooted in. It's in these differences, and our heart opens. We love more when we can appreciate differences.
I have a few questions. I don't know if anybody else does, but
Go for it.
I have the mic. So the first one, this one, hopefully I can word this to where it actually makes sense. But a lot of times, in just any kind of discussion, but I feel like especially this, one of the reasons people talk past each other is because they don't have a common understanding of what's called first principles. And I feel like this is definitely one, especially with that question of, male and female are equal, but they're different, right? We tend to think of equality as, being exactly the same rather than something different. So do you see any first principles that we need to somehow get people to see first in this talk about gender and sexuality before we can even get on to the more nuanced and complex points?
That is a question for a philosopher.
In the wrong major. I'm a marketing major.
Well, then I will just speak from a non-philosopher's perspective. My husband is a philosopher, so he'd be able to give you a great answer about principles, first principles. But I think one of them is what I already alluded to, is just an appreciation between males and females, because we're combative these days instead of appreciating each other. So that sort of combativeness needs to go away, and we need to appreciate each other and really celebrate each other. So that's one thing. Another first principle would be, and I think that this is great, and this moves toward your question about equality. The reason why I love Edith Stein's arrangement, humanity, sex differentiation, and individuality, is because she celebrates the sort of individuality that I think is really important here. We live in a very individual society where like the individual is respected. You just seek what's good for you individually, that sort of a thing. But I think that what she does so beautifully is to say we can be individuals, but it's nested within communities. It's nested within the human community. It's nested within the male and female community. It's nested within all of these small communities that we're in. So I think it's a recovery of community is another first principle. And everybody's desperate for it. Everybody's lonely. Like we've got to recover a strong, strong community where we know each other and we can appreciate each other. I think that those are some fundamental principles. And when it comes to another fundamental principle, especially when it comes to transgender identity, is to tell people, listen, I mean, wide range of individual ways that you can manifest your femininity or your masculinity. There are a wide range of things. There are no restrictions on how you can manifest that. So do it. Be the person God has made you to be. Be the person. But it doesn't have, it's not a rejection of your body. It doesn't happen when you reject your body or that male community or the female community. It doesn't happen there. So that's another fundamental principle, I would say. Any other philosophers in the room who want to add other fundamental principles?
Ooh.
So I have a question. I don't know if this is like philosophical, but
I hope it's not.
earlier you mentioned from like the whole of the identity, 1/3 or even less is biological and like genes, and leaving that 2/3 or more is like environmental. I would assume like cultures and just where they were raised and the ways. So very briefly, if you could explain maybe some of those
Sure.
that you've seen that has some sort of effect on that, and if there are, which of course there are there any ways or is there anything that we should do as a community, society to kind of maybe catch that early on to maybe prevent those people from having those pains of not knowing who they are?
Sure. So I'm going to divide this up into young children, and then teenagers, and then to maybe adults, we'll see. For young children, they have found certain patterns. So these are some things they found. Number one, you look at the family of origin. They often find, and there's this researcher up in Canada who again is not a Christian man. I mean, he's a completely secular researcher and is a highly esteemed researcher in Canada. His name is Kenneth Zucker, Zucker. And some things that he found was that whenever kids were brought into his gender identity clinic, he would first go through this whole battery of tests for the parents. Because especially for very young kids, he said that sometimes the mother would have some kind of, there was just something that was going on in her psychologically, and then without meaning to, it would manifest itself to the kids. For example, there was a mom who brought her son in, and she said that because I think he was cross-dressing, I think that's why she brought him in, and was saying he thought that he was a girl. And so she brought him into the clinic, and Kenneth Zucker started interviewing this mother and put her through a battery of tests, found out that she had been the victim of a violent rape when she was younger, that without meaning to, she'd sort of internalized this hatred and fear of men and did not at all realize that perhaps she was projecting this onto her son. And so Kenneth Zucker actually said, you know what, Mom? Let's actually get you help. Let's not worry about your son right now. Let's just go ahead and get you some help so you can work through that trauma of yours. And the cross-dressing disappeared in the son. So sometimes you have something's going on and the parents are within the family unit. Like I have heard of family units, and there was one that I heard of just recently where the mom is actually, she has a very sensitive boy, and so she's the one who's telling him, maybe you're trans, which breaks my heart because it takes away, at that young of an age, is taking away the freedom of that boy by repeating this to him and suggesting it to him, that because he never brought it up himself. You know, it's something that this mom brought up just because he was a sensitive boy. So those are some things. They say that rejection of same-sex peers. So if you never feel like you fit in with your same-sex peers, then this can cause, they found this to be a pattern sometimes too, in very small children, is they never get that validation from their same-sex peers. That's another thing. They've also found, I listed some so these are small children. You mostly look at the family dynamic, and then you can also look at some of that same-sex peer rejection. There's also, it's somewhat common for 3 or 4-year-olds when they're just trying to figure out, they're just learning how to tell differences between things. It's fairly common for them to say, to try it on and to say, like for a little boy to say, my son says all the time, when I was a girl, you know, because he's trying it on. This is fairly common. He's trying to figure out this whole distinction here. So he'll often say, Daddy, when you were a mama, and, you know, he's like, well, I wasn't a mama, you know, but so that's fairly common. But you can see how if a parent hears that and reinforces it, so parent reinforcement sometimes also contributes to a later identity, is what they've often found, having the parent encouragement or reinforcement. Let's fast forward to teen years. In teen years, that's where we saw that big jump. It often coincides with puberty, like I said, for young women at least. So, and any woman who's been through puberty knows that it's pretty awful. So part of this makes sense. But they also found some of the things I listed, past trauma. And trauma can be as simple as, I moved away from all my friends. Like for a 12-year-old, remember middle school? This is a huge deal. I moved away from all my friends, and that caused some trauma for me. Or if there's autism, there's actually a high correlation between kids who are test for autism, positive for autism, and then who come out with a trans identity. Huge correlation between those two. We also talked about some other things, the friend groups, especially among females. They found if one member of a friend group comes out as trans, then the likelihood increases that another friend would. If 2 friends do, then sometimes the whole peer group will come out as trans together. So that's another really powerful factor. And I know that and then all the YouTube, social media viewing. So what some social workers have actually said for parents, if you have a teenager who comes out and it comes out of the blue. So this is what's happening. You'll find sometimes these teenagers who haven't shown any signs of gender dysphoria until those puberty years, and then they'll come out as trans all of a sudden without any sort of warning signs. That's where you're seeing that big gap, that big jump. The social worker will say things like, number 1, you need to get that kid off the internet and into the real. Maybe take a family vacation together. Make sure lines of communication are open. You don't want to encourage, you want to say, listen, I've got to hold a line. Like I've got to hold a line here, no medical interventions, no surgical interventions, she'll say, because what often ends up happening is the likelihood that that kid will then move away from the trans identity increases exponentially if somebody isn't there saying, come on, I want to encourage you in this. And this is a shocking statistic. Among children who identify as trans, 80 to 95% of them grow out of it if they're allowed to go through puberty, all the way through puberty. 80 to 95%. So this is why parenting matters. This is why peer groups matter. It's why it matters that kids are out in the real and they're not always online. It's why peer groups matter, all of those things. And then mental health, good solid mental health. Work on that. That's one of the environmental factors too, yeah. Okay. Any other questions? Anything else that you've heard that you wonder about? Yes.
Hi. So I've had a bunch of loved ones and friends like come out as homosexual or like experiencing same-sex attraction. And I was wondering, how do I respond to them saying, why did God make me like this? Or how come, or God must have made me like this, so it must be like the truth. I must stay like this. Or I need to do this in order to be happy. How do I respond to that statement? Because I feel like that's very common and very hard to like interact with them in that, because it speaks to my compassion. I'm like, ooh, I don't know how to answer you.
Yeah. You mean it speaks to your compassion, saying, you just want to say, I know.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Father Craig, have you had experience with this? Would you like to? And I can tell you, I have family members too, and I can maybe tell you a
Yeah,
little
so
bit.
I think probably the reason she's kicking it to me is because I was a chaplain for an organization called Courage here in the Diocese of Austin for about 4 years. And so I worked with Catholic men and women who experienced same-sex attraction, and basically was their chaplain for a group that would meet regularly together to support these men and women in living their faith out and growing in their faith and wrestling with these questions. And this question in particular is one that does come up, and it's actually one, again, lead with love and compassion and say, wow, yes, that's really a challenging sort of way to feel. I don't know what that's like for you. Tell me more. What is that like for you? And then I would offer the conviction of our faith to say, now what our faith says about this is that God didn't make you this way. Right? Because he doesn't set us up for failure. If he asks for us to live a way of life, it's something that is possible for us to live. And so, the effect of sort of the original sin that enters into the world means that we live in a fallen world, which means that there's an effect on the spiritual, on the soul, and on the body. And one of those effects is what we call concupiscence. And this means that our passions, our desires, don't always align with what's truly good for us, right? What's actually going to satisfy and fulfill us and make us happy. And so it creates this dissonance, this disconnect with the human person where we want something, but it won't actually satisfy what will fulfill us. And we experience this in so many different aspects of life, right? One of the big ones is food, yeah? When we go to a restaurant and our passions, our desires say to us, well, we should have the triple cheeseburger, the double milkshake, the big fries or whatever. And we know that, acting on that once won't kill us, but if you do that for every meal that you go to, and you constantly, operate from that place of that desire, it will lead to some pretty serious consequences ultimately. And so you have to learn, in order to be healthy, how to say no to what you want for the sake of what's good for you, what is true for health, right? And so that's usually the sort of steps I walk through with people, and we talk about that and say, God doesn't want you to fail, and there's a way forward here. But God didn't make you this way. This is an effect of the woundedness of our human nature, of how, and our experiences, it varies for every one of us. Every one of us has to pick up that cross and walk daily, and this is maybe the cross that you've been given. And the lie is that if you act on this desire, you will be happy. And the reality is that this is not the case for most people. And the men and women that I worked with would tell you that they've lived the gay lifestyle, they've had partners, they've done these things. And it's interesting, most of the people would come back to the faith later in life after having tried all of those things and find them to be wanting and unfulfilling. And so the men and women that I would often meet with are the people who have realized that the promise that if I act on these desires that somehow I'd magically be fulfilled and satisfied was untrue. And now they're trying to live what the Catholic Church has taught them to be true. And they're finding, yes, it's difficult, yes, it's hard to deny those things, but it brings a greater wholeness, a greater integration of the person, a greater fulfillment. And they're their best witnesses and testimonies for those things. And I was actually supposed at the end of this talk to give a plug for Courage, so it's perfect. But if you want to go to couragerc.org or .com, I can't remember which one it is, That website has lots of great resources for Catholics who experience same-sex attraction. Also, truthandlove.com is meant to be a help for those who are trying to accompany others who experience same-sex attraction. Some of those resources work very well as well for walking with men and women with gender dysphoria who are experiencing, this sort of experience of feeling like they're trapped in the wrong body and things like that. And yeah, does that kind of correlate with what you would respond with?
Absolutely.
Good.
Because that was one thing that I hope you got from the prepared remarks was, one thing that I hope you got from the prepared remarks was that the church isn't being oppressive or repressive. It's just saying this is where full life lies. That down those other paths, you won't find the fullness of life that you're looking for. This is where the fullness of life lies. And I think that this makes me bolder when it comes, especially when you're talking to people who don't agree with you. It makes me bolder in it because I know that there's this underlying great compassion and desire for wholeness that underlies church teaching. And that's what I want to share with people. That's all.
I guess we're going to wrap it up. Is that what's going on? Okay, let me come up here. I figure it is time, yeah. David, you've got stuff? Okay, I'll let David do it then. I'm not in charge, actually.
Hey, everybody, thanks for your attention. If you have any other questions, feel free. I can stay after a little while if you want to ask me some other personal questions. I'm happy to answer.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Stewart. Let's give her a round of applause. Going back to your presentation, a couple of things that stuck out to me that as we leave here tonight, I want to make sure that we all remember. First and foremost, to seek to understand and to listen first, right? And then when we do speak, to speak with charity, to speak to the heart before we try to prove all of the right points. But then the thing that struck me the most about all of this and like all of the science and all the other things was that you said that it is often in the place of our deepest pain in which Jesus wants to meet us most intimately. And that spoke to my heart. I don't know if that spoke to you, but to, as we remember all of the compassion and all of the charity that we have in these conversations, to encourage people in that Jesus wants to meet us in this place, and it's not easy and it is difficult, but to let Jesus meet us there and to be open to that. And Father Craig mentioned courage. I just do want to confirm with you guys that if you're looking for resources for yourself or for friends or for family members who are struggling with same-sex attraction and want to still live a full life in union with the church and all of those things, it is couragerc.org. But also come meet with me. I've got more information on the Diocese of Austin Courage and also like working with our missionaries and having a community of people around you to be open with about these things and to know that there is a place of support and structure here for you that, we want to walk with you in this. And then finally, a PSA that has nothing to do with anything that we talked about tonight. The city of San Marcos called and said that a water main has broken. And so the entire city of San Marcos, we're under like a water boil notice, so don't drink your tap water without boiling it first, and your Brita filter is also not going to do the trick. You need to boil it. So be sure to do that. And before we close in prayer, I want to invite up our Focus Team Director, Ben Guerra, for a quick announcement.
Hey guys, just wanted to invite you after this talk, after we wrap up with prayer, to come get some free pizza out in the backyard and find out more about Seek right there. It's our national conference with Focus, and it happens every year. This year it'll be in February. So come outside and get some pizza and find out more about it, and we'll give you information about registration and also what's happening, the awesome speakers and opportunities that'll be at that conference. So come outside afterward and hang out.
Great, thanks, Ben. Let us close in a prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Heavenly Father, you are good. You are holy. We praise and bless your holy name. I thank you for the gift of each and every one of the men and women in this room. I thank you for the love that you've poured out upon each and every one of us, the ways that you continue to call us to yourself. I ask that you would help us to be a community of love, a community in which others can come to encounter your Son, Jesus Christ. And I ask that you would help us to be his hands and feet, to do your mission and to do our mission to bring the wisdom of Christ to the Texas State campus. We give all glory and praise to you as we say, glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, a world without end. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. All right. Thanks, guys.